Most Catholics actually do not have a good understanding of this teaching at all. And the teaching is salvation by faith and works. We're going to talk about that today, and I'm going to make a distinction that I hope makes this crystal clear so that we can all agree on it, Protestants and Catholics together. So let's take a look at Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. St. Paul says this, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." So what is St. Paul saying? Our salvation comes from God and is entirely his free gift. Even if a man were perfect naturally, he couldn't look up at the heavens and say, "God, now you owe me this grace." Being in God's grace and being in his friendship is beyond what can be merited by human nature alone. So the beginning of grace must come entirely from God, and it cannot be earned. However, James 2:24 says something that seems to contradict this. St. James says that a man is saved by works and not by faith alone. So how do we reconcile these two teachings of St. Paul and St. James? St. Paul says salvation's God's gift, 100% free, God's gift. James says that a man is saved by works and not by faith alone. Here's the distinction that you need to make in order to get this clear. The first grace cannot be merited. You cannot bring yourself from a state of sin, from a state of being at enmity with God and not being his friend, into God's good grace and into being his friend, into his friendship. You cannot do that. That must be 100% God's free gift. However, once you have the gift of God's grace, you're expected to use it well and to bear fruit. And if you do not bear fruit, Jesus says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Any branch that does not bear fruit shall be cut off and thrown into the fire." So that's the distinction that we have to be able to make. The first grace cannot be merited. By its very nature, it must be a totally free gift of a loving God. But once we have that gift, we're expected to cooperate with it, with our free wills, and to bear fruit. So, are you saved by works? No, you're not saved by works, insofar as no work that you do before grace can earn you grace. So your works cannot merit you grace, and they cannot merit you your salvation before you have grace. However, once you have grace, and once you have those gifts of God, you must bear fruit in order to be saved. That's why St. James says that we are saved by works. If a man has no good works and no good fruits, then he cannot be saved. And a common objection that I get to this, that I've seen probably 50 times now in the comments, is, what about the good thief on the cross next to Jesus? That sounds like a pretty good objection, but let's take a look at it and break it down a little further. Traditionally, the thief on the cross is named Saint Dismas, and he's recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church definitely teaches that Dismas, who has no good works, is in heaven. How can this be? Saint Dismas, hanging on the cross next to Christ, seems to start reviling him with the other thief. Later, he sees Christ's meekness, and he sees the strength in Christ, and seems to be converted. And this is what happens in Luke's gospel. Dismas, the good thief, looks at the other thief and says, "Why are you reviling him? Because he's suffering the same punishment we are, and we're suffering it justly." And he turns and says, "Lord, remember me when you enter into your kingdom." He then proceeds to patiently endure his sufferings, to profess Christ as the Lord, and to die a good death. After his conversion to Christ, he does every good work that is possible for a man in his situation. He's converted to Christ in Luke's gospel. He professes the Christ to be the Son of God, the Messiah. He suffers and endures his sufferings patiently, and then dies a good death. What other possible good works could you have wanted from him at that time? He does every good work that it's possible for him to do until the time when he expires. So we see that even this apparent exception to the rule still has good works. Granted, they're few, because he only had maybe a few hours before they came and broke his legs and killed him. But they're there. So that's the distinction I wanted to make today. The distinction between your initial grace, your first grace, 100% God's gift, cannot be earned by any man. I cannot earn my first grace. You cannot earn your first grace. Nobody can. God's free gift. But once you have God's grace, you must, absolutely must, bear fruit.